the public interest. In vain that he danced his pathetic minuet. She was adamant. But he, too, through all his embarrassment, showed no sign of yielding, and when at last he left her, nothing had been decided. The whole formation of the government was hanging in the wind. A frenzy of excitement now seized upon Victoria. Sir Robert, she believed in her fury, had tried to outwit her, to take her friends from her, to impose his will upon her own. But that was not all. She had suddenly perceived, while the poor man was moving so uneasily before her, the one thing that she was desperately longing for, a loophole of escape. She seized a pen and dashed off a note to Lord Melbourne. "Sir Robert has behaved very ill," she wrote. "He insisted on my giving up my ladies, to which I replied that I never would consent, and I never saw a man so frightened. I was calm, but very decided, and I think you would have been pleased to see my composure and great firmness. The Queen of England will not submit to such trickery. Keep yourself in readiness, for you may soon be wanted." Hardly had she finished when the Duke of Wellington was announced. "Well, ma'am," he said as he entered, "I am very sorry to find there is a difficulty." "Oh," she instantly replied, "he began it, not me." She felt that only one thing now was needed. She must be firm. And firm she was. The venerable conqueror of Napoleon was outfaced by the relentless equanimity of a girl in her teens. He could not move the Queen 1 inch. At last she even ventured to rally him. "Is Sir Robert so weak," she asked, "that even the ladies must be of his opinion?" On which the Duke made a brief and humble expostulation, bowed low, and departed. Had she won? Time would show, and in the meantime she scribbled down another letter. "Lord Melbourne must not think the Queen rash in her conduct. The Queen felt this was an attempt to see whether she could be led and managed like a child." Note: the exclamation, "They wish to treat me like a girl, but I will show them that I am Queen of England," often quoted as the Queen's, is apocryphal. It is merely part of Greville's summary of the two letters to Melbourne. It may be noted that the phrase, "The Queen of England will not submit to such trickery," is omitted in Girlhood, and in general there are numerous verbal discrepancies between the versions of the journal and the letters in the two books. End of note. The Tories were not only wicked but ridiculous. Peel having, as she understood, expressed a wish to remove only those members of the household who were in Parliament, now objected to her ladies. "I should like to know," she exclaimed in triumphant scorn, "if they mean to give the ladies seats in Parliament?" The end of the crisis was now fast approaching. Sir Robert returned, and told her that if she insisted upon retaining all her ladies, he could not form a government. She replied that she would send him her final decision in writing. Next morning the late Whig Cabinet met. Lord Melbourne read to them the Queen's letters, and the group of elderly politicians were overcome by an extraordinary wave of enthusiasm. They knew very well that, to say the least, it was highly doubtful whether the Queen had acted in strict accordance with the Constitution; that in doing what she had done she had brushed aside Lord Melbourne's advice; that in reality there was no public reason whatever why they should go back upon their decision to resign. But such considerations vanished before the passionate urgency of Victoria. The intensity of her determination swept them headlong down the stream of her desire. They unanimously felt that it was impossible to abandon such a Queen and such a woman. Forgetting that they were no longer Her Majesty's ministers, they took the unprecedented course of advising the Queen by letter to put an end to her negotiation with Sir Robert Peel. She did so. All was over. She had triumphed. That evening there was a ball at the Palace. Everyone was present. Peel and the Duke of Wellington came by looking very much put out. She was perfectly happy. Lord M. was Prime Minister once more, and he was by her side. 8. Happiness had returned with Lord M., but it was happiness in the midst of agitation. The domestic embroglio continued unabated, until at last the Duke, rejected as a minister, was called in once again in his old capacity as moral physician to the family. Something was accomplished when, at last, he induced Sir John Conroy to resign his place about the Duchess of Kent and leave the palace for ever; something more when he persuaded the Queen to write an affectionate letter to her mother. The way seemed open for a reconciliation, but the Duchess was stormy still. She didn't believe that Victoria had written that letter; it was not in her handwriting, and she sent for the Duke to tell him so. The Duke, assuring her that the letter was genuine, begged her to forget the past; but that was not so easy. "What am I to do if Lord Melbourne comes up to me?" "Do, ma'am? Why, receive him with civility." Well, she would make an effort. "But what am I to do if Victoria asks me to shake hands with Lehzen?" "Do, ma'am? Why, take her in your arms and kiss her." "What?" The Duchess bristled in every feather, and then she burst into a hearty laugh. "No, ma'am, no," said the Duke, laughing too. "I don't mean you are to take Lehzen in your arms and kiss her, but the Queen." The Duke might perhaps have succeeded, had not all attempts at conciliation been rendered hopeless by a tragical event. Lady Flora, it was discovered, had been suffering from a terrible internal malady, which now grew rapidly worse. There could be little doubt that she was dying. The Queen's unpopularity reached an extraordinary height. More than once she was publicly insulted. "Mrs. Melbourne!" was shouted at her when she appeared at her balcony; and at Ascot she was hissed by the Duchess of Montrose and Lady Sarah Ingestre as she passed. Lady Flora died. The whole scandal burst out again with redoubled vehemence, while in the palace the two parties were henceforth divided by an impassable, a Stygian gulf. Nevertheless, Lord M. was back, and every trouble faded under the enchantment of his presence and his conversation. He, on his side, had gone through much, and his distresses were intensified by a consciousness of his own shortcomings. He realised clearly enough that, if he had intervened at the right moment, the Hastings scandal might have been averted; and in the bedchamber crisis he knew that he had allowed his judgment to be overruled and his conduct to be swayed by private feelings and the impetuosity of Victoria. But he was not one to suffer too acutely from the pangs of conscience. In spite of the dullness and the formality of the Court, his relationship with the Queen had come to be the dominating interest in his life. To have been deprived of it would have been heartrending. That dread eventuality had been, somehow, avoided. He was installed once more in a kind of triumph. Let him enjoy the fleeting hours to the full. And so, cherished by the favour of a sovereign and warmed by the adoration of a girl, the autumn rose, in those autumn months of 1839, came to a wondrous blooming. The petals expanded beautifully for the last time. For the last time in this unlooked for, this incongruous, this almost incredible intercourse, the old epicure tasted the exquisiteness of romance. To watch, to teach, to restrain, to encourage the royal young creature beside him, that was much. To feel with such a constant intimacy the impact of her quick affection, her radiant vitality, that was more. Most of all, perhaps, was it good to linger vaguely in humorous contemplation, in idle apostrophe, to talk disconnectedly, to make a little joke about an apple or a furbelow, to dream. The springs of his sensibility, hidden deep within him, were overflowing. Often, as he bent over her hand and kissed it, he found himself in tears. Upon Victoria, with all her impermeability, it was inevitable that such a companionship should have produced, eventually, an effect. She was no longer the simple schoolgirl of 2 years since. The change was visible even in her public demeanour. Her expression, once ingenuous and serene, now appeared